Hello, I'm Dr. Lisa Belisle, and you are listening to or watching Radio Maine, our video podcast where we explore and celebrate creativity and the human spirit in its many forms. We are sponsored by the Portland Art Gallery in Portland, Maine. Today it is my great pleasure to interview Giovanna Gray Lockhart, who is the Executive Director of the Frances Perkins Center. Welcome. Thanks for coming in today.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm really interested to hear about the Frances Perkins Center because she is well known in history, one of the great women that we all know broke a lot of barriers, I think, in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
So I want to start with that, and then I want to understand what your connection is.
Sure. Well, Frances Perkins is one of those, like you said, just trailblazing women who she was the first presidential cabinet secretary, female cabinet secretary in this country, in 1933, when that was really something that was out of the ordinary. But really what makes her unique and special is actually going much further back in her career and in her life. Her family is from Newcastle, Maine, a saltwater farm on River Road, 57 acres. It was a brick-making facility, then it was a farm. Then it sort of during industrialization just didn't have anything happening on it. And that's when her family left and went to Boston. And so that she was raised in Massachusetts. But the place that shaped her character, and she refers to it often this way, was this property, this parcel of land on River Road. And when you think about great leaders and particularly great women, looking back in time at where the places that shaped them, it really gives you a sense of why they pursued the certain career paths that they did, why they bucked certain expectations of them. I mean, Frances Perkins graduated from college in 1902. What was expected of women at that time was very limited. She was trained as a social worker. She saw what was happening in the country in the 10s, 20s, and really took her training, and we can talk about all the amazing stories that got her there, but took her training and said, rather than helping one person one by one, I can help millions of people by creating policies that will lift folks out of poverty, help them have a living wage, make sure that they have the best possible life. And she really believed that the government had a particular role to play in that. So our center, our mission is to educate, inspire people about the importance of the government's role in economic security and social justice, and how one woman can really change the world.
That's such an important idea because I think that it's easy to get caught up in the ways that we often feel overwhelmed by what's going on around us.
Surely.
And to know that somebody like Frances Perkins, existing in even arguably more restrictive time, particularly with regard to being a woman, still made a decision. I'm not going to accept the status quo.
Yeah.
I'm going to figure out how I can impact change, and I'm going to do it in such a way that it's going to impact change for lots of people.
Yes.
So to have somebody like that as a role model, I think is really important.
Absolutely. I mean, it came at great personal sacrifice to her, too. She had worked for FDR, not just when he was president for those 12 years. She's also the longest serving cabinet member in this country, which is kind of wild. 12 years. Now, obviously, we don't have multi-term presidents anymore, but she was also working for him in New York State when he was governor. So she was the labor commissioner of New York State. And at the time, it was she was paid $8,000 a year. And that was the highest paid government salary at the time. And people were not happy about her making this salary. But he knew in order to convince her to take the job, he had to pay her what she was worth. And it's worth noting that she was the breadwinner in her family. So her husband, unfortunately, early on in their marriage, was diagnosed with mental illness. She had a 2-year-old at the time and had to work to support the family, which again was also very unusual for a woman at that time of her sort of education and background. And so she went to Washington, as she said, to serve FDR, God, and the American people. And she was so focused and so steadfast on that the personal sacrifices that she made in her, in her life really felt worth it.
Giovanna, what is your connection to the Frances Perkins Center, and how did you get involved?
So I've spent my career working in this area of gender equity and the intersection of like policy, politics, and media. And I worked in the United States Senate for 4 years for the senator from New York, Kirsten Gillibrand. And, at that point in my career, I had not really understood how important it is to have a woman at these sort of highest levels of power. I liked the idea of it. I mean, I was a gender and women's studies major. I was very politically active all through my 20s. But when I got to the Senate in meetings, I could see how, for instance, on like the Armed Services Committee, which Senator Gillibrand served on when I was there, she would bring up things like the mental health of troops who were serving at that time, in Afghanistan, and what's the impact of on their families of these long distance, these long periods of time that they're away, and what happens when they come back? How are we taking care of them? It took her voice to actually raise those issues, and she used to tell us when women's voices are heard, the outcomes are better. And I truly believe that and saw it firsthand. So I really, from that point on, committed my career to topics and raising women's voices and the power of women's voices. And I moved to Maine full time during the pandemic, like many people from big cities and other places, mostly just to make sure that my children had a nice and stable school environment. And I had been living here actually on Little John Island, just in summers and vacations. But when I came to Maine and things were going back to normal and folks were heading back to wherever they had come from, I decided to stay here. And I was consulting and working for folks in New York and Washington, and I decided I didn't want to do that anymore, and I wanted to just be in this place. So through a friend of a friend, I heard about the Frances Perkins Center, and I had known about Frances Perkins, but I didn't know she had this family connection to Maine and that her homestead was just, an hour up the road. And so I went through the interview process, and here I am. And I've been in the role for about a little over a year, and I'm trying to create a national cultural institution here in Maine. And it's been such a rewarding experience because while it was largely a volunteer-driven organization for so long, we've had some really great wins over the last year where I feel like really catapulted ourselves into a different level.
Tell me about those wins.
Okay. Well, I would say the real turning point for us last year, earlier this year, was we received a Mellon grant, a Mellon Foundation Humanities in Place grant, and it's the first one of its kind in the state. And the purpose of it is to help us with archival work and curatorial work because we own the property and we own all of the personal objects, books, papers, etc. of Frances Perkins, and they're all there, but we haven't done anything with them. So this grant is going to enable us to hire the people we need to do that work and grow the organization and make those important hires. The second thing that happened was, so this house was in the Perkins family from 1750, or this property from 1750 to 2020. We purchased it from Frances's grandson, and it needed a lot of restoration and preservation work. So we did all of that. It took 3 years, a big capital campaign, and I came in sort of at the tail end of that. But it got the attention of the White House and the Department of Interior, and they were interested in, we were designated a National Historic Landmark, but they were interested in creating more national monuments and national parks around the country that recognized important women in history. President Biden put out an executive order in March stating this and challenging the Department of Interior and the National Park Service to find these sites. Only 12 out of 430 national parks in this country tell the story of a significant woman in history. So we are hoping to be the 13th. So we ran a campaign this summer to create the Frances Perkins National Monument. And now we are just, fingers crossed, awaiting this designation before President Biden leaves office. So the great thing about that is it's enabled me to talk to so many people, legislators and community leaders and business owners, to sort of find out how they feel about it, and also teach them about Frances Perkins and this amazing woman that really is so connected to this place and this state. And we did not have a single person say to us that they didn't want it to happen. We had bipartisan support from our congressional delegation and wonderful op-eds in the Portland Press-Herald that just talked about how in these troubling times, as you mentioned, to remind ourselves of how far we've come and who those people were that helped our country get here. I can't think of someone sort of more deserving of a national monument. And then that way, when young people come and visit national parks, as they do every year, they will learn about this person and hopefully, take something away for, their own journeys.
What is the importance, in your opinion, of having representation of women amongst the national monuments?
Mm-hmm. Millions of people visit national parks every year, and we think of the national park system and those sites, not just the beautiful natural spaces like Acadia, but there are many cultural and historic places as well. But we often think about like battlefields or monuments to deceased presidents. And there aren't, the interpretation of history is so important, right? And we've learned that, especially in the last several decades, that we need to tell a different story about this country. And when narratives are inclusive of lots of different perspectives and even those subtle shifts, I took my son recently, he's a sort of history buff as much as an 8-year-old can be, and I took him to Mount Vernon, and on the tour, they were talking about enslaved people instead of slaves. When I went and did a school trip there, they referred to the enslaved people as slaves. Now that just small language shift reflects a different perspective, and now my 8-year-old is hearing enslaved people and asking questions about, why that is. And we're talking about it in a different way. The same goes for women. I think, I've spoken to school groups and I've met young women and they say, wow, someone who's also from rural Maine like me could follow this path. And, that's powerful. So representation matters, not just because it's important to understand the full scope of our country's history and all of the different nuances. And, I'll tell you the truth. A lot of people don't know Frances Perkins, and it's because she wrote herself out of history. And didn't like talking to the press and didn't write an autobiography, all the things that people in her position would have done. So we have to tell her story. And the National Park Service is the gold standard in historic interpretation, as well as, preserving spaces in perpetuity. So once the federal government owns this property that, we hope to donate to them, they are responsible for it forever. Like they talk about how they're in the forever business. And for a small nonprofit, that's really helpful because we know that this place will be taken care of, and then we can focus our mission on education and programming.
I've always been impressed with being from Maine myself and growing up here, coming back to practice medicine here, raising my kids here. I've been impressed with the fact that we actually have a pretty significant number of women who have done solid things in the world. And I know that Olympia Snow is one of them. It's a connection because you've done work with the Leadership Institute. And I'm wondering, in present day, what are things that we are doing as women and women leaders to shift the perspective, not only for young women, but really for everybody, so that it is more inclusive in the way that we approach things.
Yeah, I think that, because it's a small state in terms of numbers, not in terms of geographic area, but I think that people feel more connected to their communities, and they also feel more connected to the actual place. Like, we talk a lot about Frances Perkins when she was in Washington, she would come back to Maine. That is in 1935, that was like a pretty long journey, but she prioritized reconnecting to that place, that property, the river, the paths. And what that did for her was it restored her. It made her, reflective and sort of reorganize sort of her thoughts. And she talks about how she would take long walks. Like, these are all in her letters. She would take long walks to sort of work through problems. And I think there's something about, and I have felt this myself personally being in Maine. I mean, I spent my career in New York and Washington, and there was this constant feeling of I need to fill my time. Every minute needs to be busy, and there's a sense of urgency around, work, personal, like all aspects of my life. Oftentimes, everything kind of overlapping and being enmeshed. And since I've moved here and I've met, these incredible women, I mean, many of whom you've interviewed, I realize how they, and this is a tricky word, balance, but how they organize their lives between what's important to them, in their soul, what are their values, and how does that show up in their lives, their work, and sometimes these two things are connected, and then their family. And, I have 2 kids. I'm a single mother and in the process of blending a family, and it's complicated, but I feel so supported by the women in my life here. And it's not like anything I've experienced. And so when I look at these women who, historic women from Maine, Olympia Snow, Margaret Chase Smith, Frances Perkins, even we have a female governor. We have wonderful female leaders in this state. There is this common thread. You look at how they are connected to their families, how they're connected to their communities. And, I see Shelley Pingree all the time. This is not usual for in other places to see your member of Congress sort of just at, regular community events. That helps, when young people, and this is, Olympia Snow's Institute talks a lot about this, understanding your values, having a vision for what your life can be and how you're going to turn those values into action, but then using your voice. And then when they can see other women doing that or learn about women in history who are doing that, it tells you that it's possible. Growing up, I didn't know what was possible. It took me a while to figure that out. And so I'm just thrilled that my daughter's growing up here and seeing, how you can really be the truest form of yourself, but also have big goals and that they're achievable.
As you're talking, I can't help but think about not only my own daughters, but also my mother, my grandmother, the very important women in my life. And I guess I should say grandmothers, because we have all of these people that are around us. And I think about the context from which each of us came. And this is something that for my mother and I, we will have conversations around my grandmother, who was alive during Frances Perkins' time. And she was from a large family, but she decided, rather than making the choice of being home with children, she became a nurse. She joined the military.
Wow.
She was, a military nurse at a time when military nurses were not recognized as being part of the military.
Of course.
And then my mother making her choices and, becoming a teacher. And and now my daughters, and I want to somehow bridge the gap. I want to be able to say what we have right now, it probably feels less than ideal. And it is. Mm-hmm. It is certainly less than ideal where we are now. Yeah. But we have so much more than what we had before. Yes. So what lessons can we draw from what happened and how we got to where we are now that we can move forward? So rather than being discouraged, we can kind of really embrace that need to stay energized.
If I knew the actual answer to that question, I would be sort of shouting from the rooftops. But you talk about the inspiration of grandmothers and mothers and people who sort of trailblazed before us. And Perkins was inspired by her grandmother, who told her, Frances, when a door opens for you, you must walk through it. And that sort of stayed with her. And so, there were plenty of moments where she could have said, you know what, this is too much. The pressure is too hard. The sexism, the misogyny that I'm facing every single day is just too much. But she just remembered that I am helping other people. And that was core, to her values. But it's hard to see what's happening, in the news right now. And I worked in politics for a long time and in advocacy, and progress feels slow when you're in it. And wins either at the legislative level, like in Congress, or even at the community level, it feels so arduous. However, it's still so important because that work, that iterative process of making progress, it has to, even if it's moving slowly, it's happening. And those progress, when I was in Congress, it was you're not going to get everything you want out of a bill, but you might get something that you want. And then you have to build on that. But I do think that the process and understanding history and how policy gets made isn't something that younger women are as attuned to. I mean, you talk to many who say, well, I didn't know that, Roe v. Wade was even a law that could be, undone. And all the things that, my mother and grandmother and so forth, had to fight for my generation and younger, I think, took for granted. And now we're seeing, okay, regardless of what your political views are, there are still real discrepancies and injustices when it comes to gender discrimination. And whether that's pay equity, I mean, women still make less than men. I think the last figure is 72 cents on the dollar. And if you're a Black woman or Hispanic woman, it's even less. So, body autonomy, pay, these are just sort of basic, human rights. And we have a long way to go. So when I talk to young people, instead of depressing them with all of those figures, I mean, we mention them, we talk about them, but in order to get inspired, you have to see that the work you're doing is actually making a difference. And there's no better way to do that than in your community. And I think that's something that women in Maine truly understand. I mean, look at the nonprofit landscape and the advocacy landscape in this state. It's largely led by women. And I have a lot of hope when I meet those Olympia leaders and I hear them talk about what they're going to do in their lives. I'm like, okay, we're going to be all right, because they have such confidence and excitement about what they're doing. But don't get me wrong. I get worried and I get discouraged, and I have to remind myself that this is worthy work to keep doing.
I think it's a helpful thing for you to reflect on that fact, that you do get discouraged.
Absolutely.
Because it's easy to look at someone who's the executive director of the Frances Perkins Center and be like, wow, she seems like she is really energized around this. She's so inspired. She's bringing this great message to everywhere, and say, I could never be that person. But if you're saying, of course I get discouraged. I mean, the fact that we had Roe v. Wade be overturned, which like you, I never really thought
That was possible.
this was possible. Yeah. And now as a woman in medicine who is caring for women, the ramifications, the actual very real ramifications that we deal with on a day-to-day basis because that was overturned has been mind-blowing. I never would have expected that in my generation professionally.
No.
So to hear you say, okay, I'm sobered by this, and yet I have to find a way every day to continue to do the work, to continue to show up in whatever way is possible for me in that moment at that time.
When you look at who's creating the laws, right? I mean, yes, we've made huge progress and there are incredible women in Congress and at the highest levels of government now. There's been many, many, many female cabinet secretaries since Frances Perkins. But I saw a shift probably in like 2017, after the presidential election in 2016, I saw, obviously, there were many women who ran for office. That 2018 midterm election was like a record year for women running for office. But what I saw that was different than before and in politics, and I worked on my first presidential campaign in 2004, was women starting to talk about their personal lives and their families and their struggles and their health conditions and all the different challenges they had. And it really was different, right? Before that, I felt like, and this is certainly true with Frances Perkins, you have to present like a perfect image, like glass, don't get too excited, don't get too upset. I mean, Frances said in her this is in her oral history, which when you have many hours, it's worth listening to. But she talks about when she first got there in her first meeting, she's surrounded by men, obviously, all white men, and all men who, come from either wealthy families or created wealth themselves. And she is a woman from a farming, brick-making family in Maine. Now, she said, I didn't want to talk too much because I didn't want them to think, oh, this is, of course, she's a woman, so of course she's talking too much. But they would all go around the table, it's like this long rectangular table, and you sit in order of your sort of like seniority and what your department is. And, this is the Great Depression. There's like millions of people out of work. Her position as labor secretary was like quite important, but she did not speak up, and he would call on her. So sometimes it takes a man in power to lift women up too. So I don't want people to lose sight of that. It's not just women that have to lift up women. That's important. But we look at, there are men who are in power, and when they say, I'm going to put a woman in a leadership position, that's really important too. So I hope that the men who are listening and they're thinking about, hiring in their organizations and who gets promoted and when, to think about women think about their responsibility to women in leadership. And then back to what I was saying, earlier about just this sharing more depth of yourself. It's humanizing and it's relatable. And I think I like this trend that I'm seeing of women running for office and talking about their challenges with caregiving, whether it be their children or elderly parents, and oftentimes for people my age, both. That if Frances had talked about the multiple miscarriages she had and, the baby that she lost in childbirth, those are really difficult things. And all the while she's like having this huge, big job. I think that that realness and understanding that authenticity in people, not only does it help them be a better leader, but it helps the people who are either voting for them or working for them really connect.
My mind is actually, it just has so many different kind of subplots that I feel like I would love to explore more. And I'm trying to figure out which one rises to the top for me the most. I think for me, it's the idea of story and the idea that you've just described, that context is truly everything. And when we read about, particularly, it seems like leaders who tend to be male, there often is a conversation around, let me tell you about all the leadership things I did in my workplace. And there's less about how did I get to be in a place where I could focus on this and I could do these things. And this is actually a conversation my mother and I have quite a bit because my father was a doctor. And for many, many years, what she did was she raised the 10 children that she gave birth to, and also went on and is an incredibly intelligent woman and became a teacher and has done a lot in the community. But I don't think we often hear about the context when it comes to how was it possible if you were a man for you to do these things? Because sometimes you actually do have quite a bit more support than some of the women that do great things.
Sure.
Not everywhere.
If someone's raising your 10 children, that's what's enabling you to go to work every day.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, and my father was always very much about the partnership.
Yeah.
And everybody knew that they were in partnership. And I think about my Uncle John, who he went in and was high up at a national bank and hired many, many women into leadership positions. And my Aunt Sue, who was also incredibly intelligent, kind of worked with him to make it possible for him to do his job. And she had her doctorate in social work and she was doing her job. But I do think what you're describing, where women actually bring forth a more complete story and provide us with qualitative information, not quantitative information, but very important qualitative information about context. I think that power is something that we need to maintain perspective on.
Absolutely. I mean, and also don't let someone else tell your story for you. And I think when we, our responsibility at the Frances Perkins Center is to sort of bring Frances Perkins into the 21st century. But one of the principles that I talk to our staff about as we're making decisions is what would Frances do, right? How would she tell her story if she were here today? And I'm not sure that she would talk about her, her personal travails in quite the same way that we do. That being said, the story needs to be told because it's the complete picture, like you say, and that helps you understand, okay, why certain things were available to her and why certain things just were not. She never made money. This is she had enough to live on and cover her expenses. But there was when she left the administration after FDR died, she went into academia and was a professor at Cornell. This was not others went off to, the Secretary of Agriculture, Henry Wallace, went on to start Pioneer Seed Company, which, his family sold for billions of dollars. That's not what Frances didn't have those options. And so I think sometimes what would have happened if her husband hadn't gotten sick, and what would have happened if she had had more children? What would have, all of these different aspects of her personal life that just shaped sort of who she was and how she made decisions and what was offered to her. I think about it in my own life, and I'm coming from a place of real privilege to be able to choose what kind of work I want to do. But some people, really don't have that choice. And I think the more you can understand about a person's real individual lives and how, whether it's underemployment or the wage crisis in this country, all of the things, it's when you hear people talk about how it's impacting them, it puts policy in a different light, right? Not everyone has that partnership that helps them go and not worry about whether their kids will be taken care of. And I think, not to put too fine a point on it, but, that's what Perkins was trying to do, was sort of say, okay, let's create some policies so that the bottom doesn't fall out for people who don't have that support.
Well, I really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you. I did too.
I've learned so much about Frances Perkins, and I think you've given me things to continue to ponder. Even after our conversation ends.
Great.
I'm assuming that other people who are listening or watching will feel the same way. What's the best way for people to learn about the Frances Perkins Center?
Sure. We have a website, francesperkinscenter.org. And we actually have Right now, we are still collecting signatures to send to President Biden for our national monument. We've collected over 4,000 from people across the country, and we'd like to have as many as possible because those names will be added to the proclamation designating her national monument when that happens, which hopefully will be soon. But you can learn. We have a lot of information there, and you can visit her homestead between May and October. So it's a beautiful place. Actually, the trails are open all year round, so you can go, and they're very easy walking trails. So come check those out. But francesperkinscenter.org.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Dr. Lisa Belisle, and you've been listening to or watching Radio Maine, our video podcast where we explore and truly celebrate creativity and the human spirit in its many forms. Today, talking about Frances Perkins in particular with our guest, Giovanna Gray Lockhart, who is the Executive Director of the Frances Perkins Center. We invite you to learn more about the Frances Perkins Center, as we've just discussed, by going to their website. Also, we invite you to learn more about the Portland Art Gallery, located in Portland, Maine, because we truly understand creativity and we understand the importance of connections and community. Thank you so much for coming in today, Giovanna.
Thank you.